Welcome to Wednesday night online Bible study for May 5th, 2021, First Baptist Church in Macomb. Tonight we're using Eyewitness Bible study, looking at the last judge, the first king, as we're going to hear from Samuel and King Saul. Obviously this is a survey and they're covering lots of things at once, and there's many things that have to be left out, and I'm just going to try to highlight a few things here at the beginning, turn it over to the video, and then close with asking some of the key questions that video asks. Text that I'll be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 1 and 1 Samuel chapter 15. So just so that you're aware of that when we get to that point. While I'm giving you time to find that text because it won't appear on the screen behind me, I want to say one thing, and I want to express my bias to make sure we're clear about this. I always, when I read about Joshua, and in the one-year Bible, I'm in the book of Judges now. We just recently finished reading through all the book of Joshua. I always feel bad for Joshua. He follows Moses. He just has to kill people. That's his entire job. And as we'll see in this video, he even gets presented as not doing his job properly. He gets punished for basically 40 years for something he didn't do. He follows Moses, who could do no wrong in the Israelites' idea. And in this video, I believe the quote is, Joshua didn't follow the command of the people of destroying everybody in the land. If you read the book of Joshua, he got tricked. He got tricked into making an agreement with some other people who he thought were farther away but really weren't. But he kept his word, because when you make an oath, you keep it. So he did kind of get tricked, and there were some other groups that didn't enter the promised land. That wasn't his fault. So he gets kind of a bad rap, and then in like 2 sentences in the video, please hear that I always defend Joshua. So that's the bias that I bring to the table, because I just feel bad for him. God didn't speak to him like he spoke to Moses. He just has to kill people and keep killing them. Something else I'll point out in a second is something we often miss in the Judge Samuel, King Saul phenomenon. I'm going to read from 1 Samuel chapter 1, starting at verse 9. And this is about Hannah, Samuel's mom. It says, once when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord, and she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all of his days, and no razor will be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, how long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine. Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. Eli the priest answers, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked for. And we know in the narrative that Hannah has prayed for a son because, as the video will explain to you, quite frankly, that was the sign whether God blessed you or not in their culture. We can argue that if we'd like to, but in their culture, that's how it was, and that's just the way it is. So I want to make sure that we're aware of that. Something we miss in the transition between Samuel and Saul, there's several things we miss. One, the judge cycle is a whole bunch of tribes that sort of worked together when it was convenient. They were rarely together for very long. They were only together when it was convenient. Having a king means everybody's under. So you want to try to bear that in mind. Also, as Eli's sons were evil, and we'll hear about what happens to them, we also read in the biblical text something we miss. Samuel's sons were evil. So we can make fun of Eli for being maybe a bad priest and a bad this, but the biblical text has very little negative, if anything, to say about Samuel. Sometimes children are evil in spite of us, and sometimes children are really good in spite of us. So just understand it's not always cause and effect. And so the problem for the Israelites was going to be, we don't want Samuel's sons to be judge over us because they're evil and we can't respect them. We want someone else, which leads to the king controversy. Let me read to you 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 32 through 35, and we'll go from there. This is important because it's going to sound awful and violent, but it's important for the plot. This has occurred after one of Saul's mistakes. And in chapter 15, verse 32, we have Samuel. It says, "Then Samuel said, 'Bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites.' Agag came to him confidently, thinking, 'Surely the bitterness of death is past.' But Samuel said, 'As your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women.' And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal." Then it says Samuel left. Then we read in verse 4, we know with verse 35, it says, "Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again. Though Samuel mourned for Saul, and the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over them." This is the backdrop. This is the setting from the video presentation. But I think it's important as you listen, there's the judge model where there's a bunch of groups who partner together. And then there's the monarchy model, and that can be tricky. Let me turn it over to Eyewitness Bible Study, and I'll come back.
My mother was drunk in front of a priest. My mother was drunk in front of Eli the priest. At least she seemed to be. She was just mouthing words, so the priest assumed she was drunk. She was mouthing words of prayer, and when my mama prayed hard, she hardly let out a sound, and she couldn't stand still. So the priest had good reason to assume she was drunk.
The people of Israel demanded to have a king. They wanted to be like the countries around them. Their rejection of God's authority and leadership led to the anointing of Saul, the first king of Israel.
My mother prayed especially hard that day. She was childless and growing old. She desperately wanted a child. The priest heard her story, blessed her. My parents made love, God answered her prayers, and voila, I came along 9 months later. In her desperation to get pregnant, my mother had made a vow to God. She dedicated my life to him, and that is how I came to have 2 fathers. My birth father was named Elkanah. He had 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah, who is my birth mother. Peninnah bullied Hannah because she was childless. My birth forced Peninnah to behave better. My mother's vow to dedicate my life to God was enacted when I was only a few years old. She took me to Eli to be raised as a man of God. Yes, that Eli, the priest who accused my mother of being drunk. And yes, that Eli is the man who became my second father. Every year, my mother would bring me a little robe, and every year, Eli would bless her. She went on to have 3 sons and 2 daughters. But I never really got to know my siblings. They lived in the hill country of Ephraim, while I lived in Shiloh with Eli. Remember the town of Shiloh? It was located about 20 miles north of Jerusalem. About 3 centuries before my time, when Joshua led the Israelites into Canaan, they gave the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant permanent home in Shiloh. Both remained in Shiloh until my time. Remember that Joshua and the Israelites were instructed by God to completely dominate Canaan and destroy all of the peoples living there. Unfortunately, they chose not to do so. As a result of their disobedience, the Israelites would be led into idol worship and would be at war with the surviving people groups. I grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. In fact, all of Israel began to recognize me as a prophet. The Lord revealed himself to me through his word. He even warned me what would happen to the house of Eli. Eli's sons were both priests, but they were both very evil. Eli would not discipline them. In fact, they became so evil that a man came to Eli and prophesied to him that his sons Hophni and Phinehas would die on the same day, and that God would raise up a faithful priest to take their place. While Eli was still alive, the Israelite soldiers went to fight against the Philistines out near Ebenezer. The Philistines prevailed and killed about 4,000 Israelites. In their desperation, the Israelites asked that the Ark of the Covenant be brought from Shiloh, so the Lord would lead them to victory. Hophni and Phinehas, Eli's sons, brought the Ark. When they arrived in the Israelite camp, the Israelites shouted with joy. And this put great fear into the hearts of the Philistines. Unfortunately, their fear was short-lived. The Philistines routed the Israelites, killing 30,000 foot soldiers, and captured the Ark. Hophni and Phinehas died that day, just as prophesied. Eli heard the news about the Ark and his sons, and he fell backward out of his chair and broke his neck. That day I lost my father. But I became the undisputed leader of Israel. The Philistines were overjoyed to capture the Ark of the Covenant because they thought they now had control over Israel's powerful God. Instead, God plagued whichever Philistine city contained the Ark. After about 7 months, the Philistines had the good sense to return the Ark to the Israelites, along with some golden treasures. After a short detour in the town of Beth Shemesh, the Ark was moved to Kiriath Jearim, where it would stay for 20 years. Remember what was originally placed in the Ark of the Covenant by Moses? Manna in a golden jar, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone copies of the 10 Commandments. Maybe you were curious as to what was in the Ark of the Covenant after it was returned to the Israelites by the Philistines. So were 70 inhabitants of Beth Shemesh. They looked inside the Ark. They weren't authorized to do so. They were struck dead immediately by God. After the Ark was returned to Israel, the Israelites decided to turn back to the Lord and away from worship of idols. Immediately, we Israelites defeated the Philistines in a battle at Mizpah. After that, Israel was at peace for nearly the remainder of my life. I say nearly because it turned out that my own 2 sons became evil, and the Israelites refused to accept them as my successors. Instead, the Israelites insisted that I appoint a king over the country so they could be like the other kingdoms around them. I found this more than a little distressing. I turned to the Lord, as I had always done. He correctly assessed that the people were not rejecting me, but they were rejecting him, just as they had done since the time of Moses. Rather than punishing them, God had me warn them of the many disadvantages of having an earthly king instead of a heavenly king. No matter that it was a horrible choice, the people continued to insist on an earthly king. God granted their request. Under God's direction, I anointed an unknown farm boy as the first king. Other than being tall, he wasn't much to start with. But he must have been the best choice that God had. And he did turn out to be a powerful warrior and a builder of the kingdom of the United Tribes of Israel. I'll let him tell his story, but I do want to describe the beginning of his downfall, as it concludes my own story. The Amalekites were Israel's longtime enemy. These people had tormented Israel when they left Egypt. At that time, God vowed to erase any memory of them from the face of the earth. God ordered Saul to completely destroy all of the Amalekites and all of their animals. King Saul chose to almost wipe them out. He spared the king and all of the choice animals. When I found out that Saul had willingly disobeyed God, he made all kinds of excuses. I prophesied the end of Saul's kingship. Because of Saul's disobedience, the Amalekites continued to torment the Israelites for hundreds of years until the time of Haman, the enemy of Queen Esther. Perhaps King Agag of the Amalekites can be seen as a symbol of sin in our own lives. We are instructed to completely eliminate it, not make excuses for it, not let it keep on existing to torment us and our families. Rather than be like Saul, who let the symbol of sin live. Maybe do what I did. I hacked Agag to pieces. God searched for a man after his own heart and found a shepherd boy. I anointed him as the next king many years before he actually became king.
Nearly every young person fantasizes about being a king or queen, but I did not. I was quite content to be a farmer. However, when God called me to be king, I followed his command. My first job was to unite the 12 tribes of Israel under my command. This was a bigger task than you would imagine. For hundreds of years, each tribe ruled itself. Each tribe relied upon its elders to set the rules, enact justice, and train farmers to act as soldiers. Overcoming and replacing these traditional tribal leaders was an immense task. My second job was to prepare the Israelites to withstand the Philistines and then to defeat the Philistines. I spent my entire kingship fighting the Philistines and other enemies of the Israelites. That probably sounds like a trivial order, but you have no idea of some of the underlying factors involved. One of my biggest challenges was that the Israelites had been under the dominion of the Philistines long enough that the Philistines completely controlled the iron making. Israelites had virtually no iron weapons and even depended on the Philistines for iron plowed tips. And our people were used to being farmers, not soldiers. However, we overcame all of that and became formidable enemies. You've heard of my debacle with the Amalekites. I finally confessed to my disobedience, but God could see that my heart was hard. Through Samuel, God went ahead and chose my successor. Much to my dismay, my successor was not going to be my own son, but a shepherd named David. God completely blessed David. He became my most valuable soldier. Under his leadership, my soldiers started turning the tide against the Philistines. The more successful David was, the more jealous I became. My jealousy got so bad, it possessed me, literally. A violent, evil spirit entered me. So violent. And David was my sole target. Jonathan, my son, became best friends with David. Ironic twist. David married my daughter after he and his men were able to defeat the Philistines. Ironic twist, again. My daughter and my son helped David escape my murderous attempts. This allowed him to go to the countryside and amass a band of renegade soldiers. I chased him relentlessly. Didn't matter. He always escaped. God, my countrymen, and my family conspired to end my potential dynasty. I had been king for 40 years. It was clear to me that I needed to try to defeat the Philistines once and for all. Please notice that I said it was clear to me. Because of my debacle with the Amalekites, Samuel had refused to communicate with me before his death. I could not rely on his direction from God, so I felt like I had to rely on my own decisions. I amassed the entire nation of Israel and prepared to fight the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. I was certain that Israel was finally strong enough to defeat our enemies. I even chose the terrain so that the Philistines could not take advantage of using chariots, which we did not have. I thought I had everything under control. The army of Israel was slaughtered. I was killed. 3 of my sons were killed. It was certain that my family would not continue as a dynasty. David did not take away the dynasty from my family. I did that myself. I did try to amass great wealth. I did not lead my people into idolatry. I did not tax my people unfairly. I believe I did a good job of fighting our country's enemies. I unified the tribes of Israel so that the next king would have a good base to build his kingdom. Was I a good king or a bad king? What do you think? I did all this with very little direction from Samuel. If he had spent more time mentoring me or teaching me to make godly decisions, perhaps I would have done better. Unfortunately, I did disobey God from time to time. However, I did not lead anybody into worship of any false god. I was insanely jealous of David, my anointed successor, but no harm really ever came to him because of it. I never wanted to be king. I didn't ask for it. I was a farmer, a good one. But a good king or a bad king? Who's to say?
Hope you enjoyed hearing from Samuel and Saul. Let me just tie these things together more of a Bible study standpoint and try to do it kind of chronologically. As you read 1 Samuel, one of the questions you have to kind of ask yourself is, why did God keep Hannah from having children? Now we read that she has more children after Samuel. Why does this happen? Is this similar to John 9 and the blind man that was born blind, and then we read that this was done for the glorification of God? Is this more of the examples we've been looking on Sunday mornings of the master chess player moving the pieces around and we can't see? But what's it like to live that way? How hard must that have been for Hannah? How hard must that be for so many of people in this world who are followers of Jesus, who wonder if God even cares, because they can't see the big picture? Before we become critical of people who abandon faith because they can't see the big picture, how hard must that be? I think that's an important point we want to make in this process. And I know I'm pulling out a standard straight from the comic books into the Marvel MCU, but it's the Black Panther King T'Challa question. It's how does one be a good king and a good man at the same time? There are many compromises. This is a constant struggle of making the decision that's best for everyone, but often you find yourself in morally gray areas, if not morally bankrupt areas. It is very difficult to be in charge of everything and be a good man or a good woman at the same time. And Saul finds himself in that spot, and every king of Israel finds himself in that spot. The video you just watched, you have Saul asking the question, was I a good king? Was I a bad king? Spoiler alert as we move ahead, David was a decent king who comes after. Solomon is a terrible king. Now you're thinking, what do you mean Solomon was a terrible king? Solomon is a terrible king. By all standards, Solomon was an awful king. He may be wise. He may have been powerful. But he was a terrible, terrible king. Evaluating just mistakes that were made, Saul was a better king than Solomon. And as we'll read in the text to remind you, God leaves Saul. And it's a very, very slow, slippery slope. Let me read to you from 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 22 through 26. This is kind of the setup for the incident. The Amalekites are defeated, but they do not follow God's command to kill everyone. Now, as much as we struggle with that morally and ethically, this would have been the right decision in that time, just as other cultures were used to punish the Israelites. God uses the Israelites to punish other cultures. So it fits into their theology, even though it makes me uncomfortable. It's still valid. We have the issue of Samuel calling out Saul because they kept some stuff they weren't supposed to keep. They were commanded not to do that, and they kept it, and they kept some people alive, like they were trophies. They kept King Agag alive, the king of the Amalekites. And we read in 1 Samuel 15:22. It says, "But Samuel replied, 'Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice, as much in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king.'" Now, as we read through this is really Saul's first faux pas. He makes a slight faux pas earlier, but this is his first really big, huge mistake. And God just leaves him. And then we read Saul appearing to be repentive in verse 24 of 1 Samuel 15. It says, "Then Saul said to Samuel, 'I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instruction. I was afraid of the people, and so I gave in to them.'" I was afraid of the people, and I gave in to them. You can read 1 Samuel and see where he might have come to that conclusion. But just so we're clear, it's hard to be a good man and a good king. Then it says, "Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel said to him, "I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king of Israel." Saul, as he says, not someone who maybe was overly qualified, not someone who lobbied to get this job. Saul is someone who slowly made a decision he thought was right that wasn't. Then he made another one he thought was right that wasn't. And then he slowly became a bittered, tormented, guilty person who was angry at everyone and had lost his first love. It is so easy for us to do that, where we very slowly find ourselves moving away from where we're supposed to be. And it happens so slowly we don't even notice. It's the frog in the kettle illustration that we use. That's what happens to Saul. And the writers of 1 Samuel want us to see that God looked around and Samuel's sons weren't going to be able to step up. Saul wasn't a great choice, and there was only David. But as I have warned you reading ahead, Solomon is a terrible king. And some of the negative characteristics that Solomon expands, he learned from his dad, David. So even though David was a man after God's own heart, he wasn't perfect either, because it slowly fades to nothing. May we all remember, when we read these sections of the Old Testament, that we, like them, can slowly fade away from God. Let's close in prayer. Holy God, thank you for the example of Saul and Samuel. Thank you for their lives. Thank you for the good things that they did. But also thank you for the things that they did that may not have been the best examples for us, that we can learn from. Help us as we try to be your people, to trust and to obey. I thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.